Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to start on time and I'm going to call my principals. We're very happy to have Jim Robenalt here, who's actually been in India several times, thanks to Monica and the professional development they do for lawyers in Nashville. And John Dean has come with him in the past, and obviously tonight we could talk a little bit about his work with John Dean. We learned about his wife Joanna last year, and Nan and I suggested that we invite her to speak. She did today. Fascinating topic, a face transplant. It was, I think students would agree with me, a compelling program and assembly. And we thought it'd be great to have Jim speak as well, and that is how this idea was born for this afternoon. This is timely because we planned also a debate tomorrow during our break time with two of our faculty members and two of our students on the impeachment process. So they're here tonight to get some ammunition for their own debates. Please join me in welcoming Jim.
Thank you, Brad. Well, first of all, this is the third time I've been to this place, and it really is an extraordinary place. It's like a college. Joanne and I went to a couple of classes today, and some extraordinary professors who were teaching. Both of them are here tonight. And it really is just an amazing thing to come to this campus and see what's going on, because in sitting through the different assemblies, a couple of things hit me. The first is this tradition when you come to speak here where you go and walk to the door, and as you walk in, everybody stands up. I mean, it really gives you chills. And then just everything they talk about. They really are building citizens here, not just kids who can go to college. I mean, real citizens who will make a difference in their communities. So it's always a pleasure to come here. And tonight, especially with where we are in our country's history and with these hearings about to start, these public hearings, it's good to look back and talk about John Dean, because John Dean was the ultimate whistleblower. It's also fun to talk about him when he's not here, because we have been doing this for a long time, and we know each other very well, and I know as much about Watergate as I think almost anybody, because I have a PhD with John Dean. We've been doing this for a long time. But it's also fun to be here because he does not like to talk about himself and brag about himself, and I think he was heroic in what he did. So I'll start off by giving you my bias. I think he was heroic in what he did. And I know that because I've listened to all the tapes. And there's one fact I'm going to tell you today that will, I think, be of interest to you to show why I consider him to be heroic. So what does Watergate teach us about impeachment? And we always start off by doing About Your Faculty. John thinks this is hilarious, that this is me watching him on television as a young kid. But think about this. He was on television in June of 1973. There were 3 networks, CBS, NBC, and ABC, and born out of Watergate, and out of his testimony in particular, was McNeil Lehrer and PBS. It really made PBS, because people couldn't watch this during the day. They had to come home at night and watch it, and they replayed it at night. And there's a great website. You can go watch the entire thing now. It's on, the Library of Congress has put it up with the Boston Public Television station. And I'm in the midst of watching it. It is riveting, all these years later, especially with where we are right now. So he had like 80 million people tuning in to see him. If you think about events in our history that have been mega television events, you have the stuff during the 50s with the House Un-American Activities. But really, it's Kennedy assassination, moon landing, John Dean's testimony, 9/11. Those are the mega events where everybody in the country gathered around a TV, and we became one huge community. And so he went from being just an obscure White House counsel to suddenly being the center of this entire controversy. And at that time that picture is taken, he's 34 years old. He had become counsel to the president when he was 31. So think about going in and taking on the President of the United States at that young, tender age in doing what he did. Here's just a little bit of a reminder for those of you who are old enough to have, how many people here remember watching John Dean? Okay, you're giving your age away. But here he is giving kind of the iconic moment from those 5 days that he was testifying before the Senate.
What I had hoped to do in this conversation was to have the President tell me we had to end the matter now. Accordingly, I gave considerable thought to how I would present this situation to the President and try to make as dramatic a presentation as I could to tell him how serious I thought the situation was that the cover-up continue. I began by telling the President that there was a cancer growing on the presidency, and that if the cancer was not removed, the President himself would be killed by it. I also told him that it was important that this cancer be removed immediately because it was growing more deadly every day.
All right. The famous cancer on the presidency line made all the headlines. But let me tell you, this is the fact that I can tell you that I think is one of the most extraordinary things. When he testified, he had no idea there was a taping system. So he was a whistleblower without protection. He was a whistleblower who had no safety net. He was flying without a parachute. He was out there sticking his neck out and saying, I'm going to do the right thing. And he knew that it was going to be the end of him. And just like today, during this period of time, he went into the witness protection program and had death threats. It was every bit as much what we're seeing today of trying to out the whistleblower. He was outed by himself and out there by himself. He had no protection at all and didn't know there was a taping system. So we'll come back to that point in a minute, but that's important because what he just said to you, I'm going to play you the Oval Office tape where he says to the President, there's a cancer growing on your presidency. It's almost word for word. His memory is uncanny. It's extraordinary. But that's one of the main facts you got to know is he did this thinking that he could just blow himself up at this point and his career was done. He could go to jail. Nobody would believe him against the President. So he's the ultimate whistleblower. Look who came to watch him testify. This is John Lennon and Yoko Ono coming to see John testify. It's the only picture I know of Lennon with his butched haircut. He had done that in solidarity with people who were protesting the war. And Brad, I heard today that a lot of these kids buzzed their head for you too, and I could see the evidence of that too. That's quite just why I like this place so much. It's an amazing place. But here's John Lennon, and he came down from New York. He stood in line with Yoko. They got their tickets. They got to go in and sit for the 2 hours that you were allowed to sit in this room, and then moved on like regular citizens. But tells you how big this testimony was that Lennon came to see Dean. The joke that Dean tells when we do this is, I never got to go see John Lennon sing, but he came to see me sing. So here's me, a little bit about me. There are 4 books that I've written. I'm a lawyer in Cleveland, but I started writing books after my mom died. And my mom was, both of my parents, this is Veterans Day, were veterans. My dad was in the Army Airborne in France. He was in a glider division, so it's a wonder that I'm here, my brothers and sisters. Just like those Band of Brother guys that you see, that was my dad. And my mom was a Navy Wave. Unfortunately, she started smoking while she was in the Navy, and she ended up dying early. So I started looking into her father. That's the first book, and her grandfather. It's called Linking Rings, William W. Durbin, and the Magic and Mystery of America. So this is my bias as I walk into this. Her grandfather, so my great-grandfather, is the guy who's pictured there. He was born right after the Civil War, a little town in Ohio. His father was a pioneer physician. His mother had her first husband killed in the Civil War at a battle not far from here at Chickamauga. And so he's born into this world where his father dies young. He becomes interested in politics, but he also becomes very interested in magic. And so he, as a young man, starts practicing magic. And I think that's perfect for politics, isn't it? And he ends up supporting William Jennings Bryan, who runs for president in 1896 in Ohio, then Woodrow Wilson, and then finally Franklin Roosevelt. And when he dies in 1937, he is the Register of the Treasury, the #2 post in the Treasury at the time, in charge of the national debt. As FDR had, given him this post. But he was also, and this is my favorite part of it, he was the president of the International Brotherhood of Magicians. So he knew Harry Houdini very well, he knew Blackstone very well, and he had this, so I had to write a book. I mean, I could not write a book about this guy, and that's what started me down this road. In 2004, John Dean came to Cleveland because Dick Cheney and John Edwards debated, a vice presidential debate that is very forgettable. But they asked me to do something on Ohio. Ohio boasts that it has 8 presidents. And so we did a seminar on that. John had just written the book on Warren G. Harding, who is our 29th president, and he was doing it for Arthur Schlesinger Jr., and he came up to the debate. We had the descendants of the Ohio presidents and the most recent authors. That's how we met. So I went over to a historical society in Cleveland and said, do you have anything that'd be of interest to John Dean on Warren Harding? He just wrote a book on him. I thought they'd have a really good button or something like that. And the guy says, you gotta come over here. I can't tell you over the phone. So I go over, he takes me in the back room, he shuts the door. He didn't close the curtains, but and he didn't put gloves on, but he puts this big box up and he pulls out this microphone and he said, do you know who Carrie Phillips is? I said, I've read enough about Harding to think that's one of his mistresses. He said, yeah, and these are the love letters that she kept, that Harding wrote to her from 1910 to 1920 on his rise to become a senator and then president of the United States. And guess what? I researched it, and there were 900 pages of love letters, some of them 40 pages long, many of them on Senate stationery. This was a married neighbor of his, a long time, this was no Monica Lewinsky. This was a 15-year affair, and it turns out this woman was a German spy. So that's what that book is about. It's then called The Harding Affair, Love and Espionage During the Great War. So the whole thing starts in Chattanooga, Tennessee. I just gave a seminar there 2 weeks ago because a German baroness was arrested there in a hotel. She had been or dancing with the officers at a camp right outside Chattanooga. Do you all know what that camp is? Fort Oglethorpe is the name of it. It's where Chickamauga took place, the battlefield from the Civil War. And so this woman had a young man under her bed who was half her age, who was an Army officer, with a code: if we leave New York, I'll say this; if we leave Norfolk, I'll say this. The Germans wanted to know how quickly we were going to get involved in the First World War. And if you know enough about that history, you know that we arrived just in time to stop the German offensive in 1918 as they were trying to take Paris and end the war. The Americans arrived just in time, turned them back at Bella Woods and the Marines, and an extraordinary story. This woman was a German spy, and she was very much involved with Warren Harding, who would become President of the United States. How's that for interesting? Could tell you a lot more about Harding, but he was a much better president. If we have some time later, I will get into that. By the way, the other 2 books are the January '73 about Watergate, Roe v. Wade, and an extraordinary month where Johnson dies and the Watergate burglars trial, real turning point in our history. And then I just wrote this book, Ballots and Bullets, on a shootout between black nationalists in Cleveland and Cleveland police 50 years ago. And the question I had when I wrote this is, why are we still here 50 years later with Black Lives Matter and with that one guy who went to Dallas and deliberately shot white policemen? So that's that book. My books are kind of all over the place. John is still married to Modine, who was quite a celebrity, and you can see why. She was, and she's an extraordinary woman in her own right, but she is his rock, and so they had just gotten married back then. John worked for the House Judiciary Committee. He then became the Associate Director of Law Reform there, and then Nixon was elected. He was not a Nixon person, but John Mitchell brought him into the Attorney General's office. And then look at this, counsel to the President of the United States in 1970. So he was 31 years old. By the way, that has a lot to do with why Watergate happened. He did not have enough criminal experience. He had none. And he was about 5 years into his practice, and he was brought over and given this enormous job. He has since written a ton of books, and you guys, if there's one book, students, I would tell you to read, it would be Conservatives Without Conscience, which is about authoritarianism in the United States. And it was started with Barry Goldwater. John was good friends with Senator Goldwater. And Goldwater's book was called A Conservative with a Conscience. And this is Conservatives Without Conscience. It's about the takeover of the Republican Party by the religious right. And it's an amazing book about authoritarianism in the United States. The one fact I'll tell you from that is studies show over and over and over again that in the United States there has always been about 30 to 35% of the citizens who are authoritarian followers. Does that sound like a familiar number to you? It should. So anyway, that's a good book to read about the social science behind it all. And then John did his big Watergate book that is all the conversations worth looking at. So we've got the Trump's whistleblower complaint, and we've got the current whistleblower. So the question that we have is, what are some of the similarities, and how is this going to play out relative to how it played out in Watergate? So we know it comes from this conversation with President Zelensky. We know John was the ultimate whistleblower. And so the question is, how did he navigate this water? All right, so that's the setup. Now let me go back and give you just a little context here about Watergate and to put you back in the perspective. At the time Watergate happened, June of 1972, John was in Manila giving a speech, and he flew back to the United States. He always says that was his first mistake. He should have stayed over there. But the cover-up starts right away. So this is true of almost every cover-up. Cover-ups are immediate, they're unthinking, they are reactionary, and the same thing happened here, where the White House knew that people from the committee to re-elect the president had been the burglars who had been arrested. And they knew Hunt and Liddy were involved, who had not been arrested. Nixon knows that within days. And what he should have done is picked up the phone, called his attorney general, and said, I know who did this. And that would have saved his presidency, frankly. But he didn't do that. Instead, the cover-up begins by saying none of these people employed by the committee to re-elect were authorized to do this. They were authorized to do it by John Mitchell. So it's a lie from the start, and this is the next day. And if you look, this is the very first Woodward and Bernstein report. And how many people have seen All the President's Men? This is the day after they're arrested. You know, you have Woodward going to the court and seeing there's a lawyer for these guys. That's the tip-off that something's going on. And then they find out a lot more. By the way, the guys who were the burglars in this were working for John Mitchell. But this guy at the very top there, James McCord, was the security guy for the committee to re-elect the president. So they were cooked from the beginning. And these other guys were all Cuban Americans. They'd all been involved in the Bay of Pigs, and they were all brought to this by Howard Hunt through a CIA connection. This guy is the reason Watergate happened. This is John Mitchell, who was Nixon's attorney general. Mitchell saved Nixon after he had lost to John Kennedy in '60, and in '62 lost to Jerry Brown's father out in California. That's when he gives this drunken, you won't have Dick Nixon to kick around anymore. That's still an extraordinary piece of film. And so he's in the wilderness. Mitchell picks him up, brings him to New York, puts him in a law firm, and he doesn't have to work real hard, although Nixon's always a hard worker, but he picks him up. So when Nixon decides to run in '67, he asked him to become his campaign manager. Mitchell knew nothing about politics, but he was a bond lawyer who knew political people around the country who were doing bond work. He becomes an extraordinarily good campaign manager. He's got a very irascible wife, Martha Mitchell. Could spend an hour talking about her and her influence on Watergate. But Nixon was worried about John Mitchell because he had sent him back to the committee to re-elect, and he thought he had approved the operation. He guessed it. He knew it. Mitchell didn't tell it to him, but he did not want to out him. He thought it would destroy him. So it's his loyalty to his friend that destroys his presidency. And it's ironic that that's the case, because everybody sees Nixon as this awful person, and in many ways he was, but in many ways there's another side to him to consider. So this is where John, White House counsel, had their office in the executive office building right next to the White House. These guys were all arrested, and Howard Hunt is in the middle of this. And the problem that they have, and one of the reasons the cover-up gets out of hand, is that these same guys who are in the prison, in the jail, two of them, Martinez and Barker, were the same guys who a year earlier for the White House had gone in to Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office to try to get dirt on him. So they broke into a psychiatrist's office in Los Angeles. It was illegal. They did it for the White House. This was after Ellsberg came out with the Pentagon Papers, and they were trying to get dirt on him. Nixon put this group together within the White House called the Plumbers, because they were fixing leaks. And they did this operation. So, you know, there was a problem here, and this guy was involved along with Howard Hunt. So the White House had not only, they could have said, this is the committee to re-elect, it's their problem, it's John Mitchell's problem, and presidency survives, but that's not what happened, and they're covering up. So this guy, Gordon Liddy, is in the middle of all of it. He walks with John the next day to say, look, my guys did it, we got to take care of them, they're in jail. Take care of them means pay their attorneys, pay their family, give them compensation, get them out of jail and bail if we can. And then he says this extraordinary thing. He says, John, I know I've done the wrong thing. I used the wrong person in this who could be traced right back to the committee to re-elect, McCord, that one guy. And if you need to, he said, you can shoot me. He literally says this to John. Tell me what street corner to be on, take me out. That's the way Gordon Liddy was. And John says, Gordon, I don't think we've gotten there yet. And that was, he had a full confession at that point about what was going to happen. So John reports up to Ehrlichman. Ehrlichman is the guy who authorized the break-in of the psychiatrist's office. Look at this. This is Ehrlichman approving this covert operation. That's his E there. Look what it says, though. If done under your assurance that it is not traceable. And this memo made it traceable because somebody kept it. He threw it away, he destroyed it, but somebody kept a copy of it. That's why John Ehrlichman went to jail, was this. So he's got a skeleton in his closet to hide from Nixon, because it's not clear that he told Nixon about the Ellsberg break-in. A couple months later, out in San Clemente, Nixon has this press conference where they say, well, what are you going to do about Watergate? You know, this is getting out of hand. Why don't you appoint a special prosecutor? Just like Mueller, why don't you, back then, why don't you appoint a special prosecutor? Nixon said, well, the FBI's looked into it, Congress has looked into it, and my White House counsel, John Dean, has looked into this, and he's concluded that nobody involved currently in the White House is involved in this debacle. Dean is watching this on television. He's thinking, you know, I didn't do any of that. You know, that didn't happen. So he knows who's going to get thrown under the bus at some point if things go the wrong way. But at this point, he's not really worried about criminal problems. He's not thinking that they're involved in obstructing justice at that point. All right? It's not occurring to him yet. And then this happens. This is the election of '72. Now, look at that very closely. You'll see Nixon won every state except Massachusetts and the District of Columbia. If you go 4 years before this, in '68, the country's divided. 4 years before that, in '74, it's all blue. This is kind of the turbulence of the time. But keep this in mind. Everybody knew about Watergate. Everybody knew that Nixon was probably behind it one way or another, and nobody cared. It's very similar to, you know, people reacting to what they want to react to and how politics controls things. So what is the reason that this happened? And I asked this in one of the classes I went to today, and one of you guys, I forget which one, had said, maybe he's not here tonight, but said Vietnam. The reason Nixon won with a landslide is he said, I will get us out of Vietnam, peace with honor. And his opponent, McGovern, said, I'll just pull us out. And the country didn't want to lose 50,000 lives and then just leave. So Nixon, it was just not palatable to people. So query about that today, about where people's politics are today. But nobody cared about Watergate. Nixon won by a landslide. So this is that picture of him during that campaign. This conversation, however, and this is where we can go to this, I'll let you hear a couple of important conversations. This is tape that was made right after the election between Howard Hunt, one of the burglars, and Chuck Colson, who was Nixon's hatchet man in the White House. And they're speaking about this. Now, what Hunt is worried about is he's going to go to trial in January of '73. He's worried that now that the election's been won, everybody's going to forget about these guys. And the money has been coming, as he says, in dribs and drabs to his lawyers. So this call he makes, and Colson records it, because Colson wants to say to him, you know I wasn't involved in Watergate, and have Hunt say, yeah. But what he ends up getting is much more than he expected. So listen to this. This starts on your first page there with Hunt saying, well, the reason that I called.
Well, the reason I called you was to get back to the beginning here, is because the commitments that were made to all of us at the onset have not been kept. And there's a great deal of unease and concern on the part of 7 defendants, and possibly, well, I'm quite sure me least of all. But there's a great deal of financial expense here that has not been covered, and what we've been getting has been coming in very minor dribs and drabs. And Parkinson, who's been the go-between with my attorney, it doesn't seem to be very effective, and we're now reaching a point at which...
Okay, you've told me all don't tell me anymore, because I understand it. Let me just...
Because these people have really got to dig. This is a long-haul thing, and the stakes are very, very high. And I thought that you would want to know that this thing must not break apart for foolish reasons.
I agree. Yeah. Oh, no. Christ, no. Everybody gets...
And while we get, third, fourth-hand reassurances, still the ready is not available.
Mm-hmm. I follow.
That's the basic problem.
I follow you. Okay.
Okay, so this is mafia kind of talk. The ready is the money. You know, the money's not there. Proud as punch, Colson runs up to see John in the executive office building, plays it for him, and John looks at him and says, do you realize what this is? This is a quid pro quo. This is a this for that. They are being quiet because we are paying them. This is obstruction of justice. And he first realizes that he's in trouble because he was involved in paying this hush money to keep these guys quiet. And so it's right there on this tape, and he now realizes he's in trouble. He does what everybody does when they get into trouble. And this guy, Richard Painter, how many people know Richard or know of him? You've seen him. He's a commentator. He's a law professor at University of Minnesota. He was Bush II's ethics counsel. He is, if you're on Twitter, get on his account. He's quite proficient at that. But he studied the psychology of cover-ups. So what's behind, why do people double down when they get into trouble? And what he looked at is psychological studies show that people who are in what's called a loss frame make risk-preferring decisions, okay? And so this all comes out of, I don't know if anybody's read this book, Thinking Fast and Slow, another important read. This is Daniel Kahneman, Princeton psychology professor. He got the Nobel Prize in 2002 for this theory called the prospect theory. What they discovered is extraordinary to me because it tells us so much about us as humans and why cover-ups happen and why things go wrong. If your frame of reference, when you have to make a decision, is a loss, in other words, if I make a decision and I've got an option over here, it's a loss, or an option over here, it's a loss, you're going to act irrationally to protect yourself from a loss. If you're in a gain frame, so think about the stock market, you're down 200, you could lose 200 more, but you're down 200. You don't want to give up that 200 and, hedge your bets. If you're up 100 and you could gain 100, you're more likely to be rational. You'll look at the market and so forth. But people make risk-preferring decisions when they're in a loss frame. So that's what happens in cover-ups. The decisions depend. So what he's saying is, and all of us have this in our brains, we hate to lose almost 3 times more than we like winning. Just our brains are wired that way. These are biases. So when you've got a situation that's a loss, you're more likely to act irrationally. Think of Bill Clinton. He had to either admit he had an affair, a loss, or go into a deposition and perjure himself and risk his presidency, a loss. So what did he do? He went in and perjured himself, even though it was unlikely that was going to, succeed. So really interesting. John is in this. And then there's another side to this where people who are in loss frames not only don't want to take the loss, they engage in magical thinking that they're going to get out of it. And this is Richard Nixon in spades. He thinks he's going to get out of this some way, shape, or form. So this is Daniel Kahneman.
We want our leaders to be overconfident. I mean, if they told us the truth about the uncertainty, we would discard them in favor of other leaders who sort of give an impression that they know what they're doing. We want overconfidence. We support it, we sustain it, and there is an awful lot of it. I mean, most of what we read in the paper is overconfidence. Sometimes it's catastrophic. Just about every war that you see, I think that's a general rule, there are optimists among the generals, and there are optimists on both sides. And that is true for a lot of litigation as well. So a lot of conflict is fed by overconfidence. There is an interesting story here of 2 biases that work in opposite directions. So one familiar, you can call it bias, but is what we call loss aversion. People put a lot more weight on negative events than on positive events, on losses than on gains. So people are loss averse. On the other hand, they're optimistic. And so many of the decisions that people make, especially in starting new businesses, I mean, that is where it's been studied most extensively. So clearly, overconfidence is rife. And overconfidence and loss aversion seem to be acting in opposite directions. From the point of view of the individuals, it is not always good to be optimistic. For example, I have no interest whatsoever in my financial advisor being an optimist. I don't care for that.
Worth studying. This guy is really deep. I mean, he is really good. And John Dean saw this loss frame idea and said, that's us. That's what happened to me. He doubled down. He started destroying evidence. He now had to make that cover-up work. And then this month comes along. So this is the month that I wrote about in January of '73, and this critical event, the end of the Vietnam War in Paris. Let me tell you one day, and think about this in American history. January 22, 1973, Kissinger goes to the White House, and there's a tape, and tells Nixon, I'm going off to sign the Paris Peace Accords, to initial them, and he gets on a plane to take off for Paris. 2 hours later, Harry Blackmun reads Roe versus Wade in the Supreme Court. 4 hours later, Lyndon Johnson drops dead in Texas. I mean, talk about these extraordinary events that are so representative. I could give you a whole lecture on Roe and what it's done to our politics, but you'll have to get the book and read it. So here's what this shows, all right? And this may be difficult for you to see, but this is this line here, which is orangish yellow, is the approval rating of Nixon. This line in the blue is people saying they want him to be impeached and removed from office. So we're seeing those stats right now. Trump's approval rating is different from the rating of people who say impeach and remove. Look where Nixon is when he ends the Vietnam War. Almost 75%. Extraordinary numbers for a president. George Bush, too, got close to 80, 90%. Nobody's ever seen that. This is really extraordinary. So he's right there. This is when John Dean testifies in June. So what you see here And one of the things, one of the main points I want to make tonight is, it took an entire year of erosion for Nixon support to end up saying remove him. We'll talk about the event that happened that really propelled this, but a lot of people think John Dean testified and Nixon resigned. That's not what happened. The support for Nixon, it took drip, drip, drip. And we'll walk through that very quickly here. So you've got first of all, the Watergate burglars trial. They all plead guilty. This is the group of them. And then a few weeks later, the Senate votes to open an investigation into the '72 election in Watergate. You know why? Because they were upset with Nixon bombing Hanoi without their being asked about it or included in that decision. They thought he was the imperial president, that they had to bring him down a notch, and this was bipartisan. Do you know what the vote was to investigate Watergate at this point in time in the Senate? It was unanimous. And then the vote in the House to start an impeachment inquiry was like 410 to 7 or something. I mean, these are extraordinary numbers compared to what we're seeing right now. So this is the group, and you all have a lot to be proud of in Tennessee because of this guy. You know who that is? Howard Baker, senator, but one of his most important things was to be the minority member to Sam Ervin, who was the Democrat, and Baker was the guy, and he's the guy that brought in Fred Thompson, who's from Nashville, to be the guy who questions people. So these guys worked together as a unit. They hung together. They did this inquiry, and they did the public hearings. So that's a big difference from today. Today, we're seeing the public hearings after the smoking gun has been produced, the transcript. In John Dean's time, the public hearings happened and started the process, and then the erosion took place. You see what I'm saying? It took a year of erosion, so that's one big difference. Nixon begins dealing with John in February of '73, one-on-one, about how to control Watergate. Remember, I told you John's in loss frame. He's fully into it. He's trying to support the president. This is what Nixon writes about him. The talk with John Dean was very worthwhile. He's an enormously capable man. I had another good talk with John Dean. I'm very impressed with him. So this is the first time that the two of them are meeting each other. Even though he's White House counsel, he always went through the chief of staff. This now is Nixon Dean one-on-one. And then this day is the day that knocks John out of his loss frame. It's the 16th of March, and on this day, two things happen. One is that Sirica finally comes out and says, I'm going to sentence these burglars a week from today on the 23rd, and I'm going to impose sentences which they believe would be like 40 years for these guys. Howard Hunt, in the meantime, this is with his lawyer, a guy named Bill Bittman, is concerned that he needs money because he believes he's been given a pardon by Nixon. He's asked for and he's received assurances that he will be pardoned if he plays hardball, pleads guilty, and goes to jail. And so we're kind of reliving that issue right now, too. There is a tape where Nixon says that Hunt's wife had been killed in a plane accident, and his case is different, and he had every reason to believe he was going to get out of jail within a year, not being in jail for 40 years, but he needed money. He needed his family. He had kids. His wife had been killed in a plane crash, and so he's demanding money, and he tells Bittman to go directly to John Dean. So Dean, meanwhile, is talking to Nixon that night saying there's going to be a sentencing a week from today, and he's still very much in the cover-up, but this is where it happens. On the 19th, this Paul O'Brien comes over to meet him and says Howard Hunt wants $185,000. He wants it by yesterday. He's about to be sentenced. And if he doesn't get it, he's going to have very seamy things to say about John Ehrlichman and the Ellsberg break-in. This is pure and simple blackmail. And Dean gets furious about it. And this is the guy, O'Brien, testifying that at the bottom it says, Mr. Dean got extremely excited. I think his exact language was, I'm tired of being put in the middle. I'm going to bust this goddamn thing up. So his own anger begins to take him out of this lost frame, and the next day he calls Nixon. So let's listen to this. This is March 20, and if you look on page 4, this is Nixon would go to the sitting room in the residence, Lincoln's sitting room, and call, and these were recorded too. So John had just gotten home, and this starts with, I think, one thing we have to continually do. So this is him.
And I think that one thing we have to continually do, and particularly right now, is to examine the broadest implications of this whole thing. And maybe 30 minutes of just my recitation to you of the facts, so that you operate from the same facts that everybody else has.
Right.
And I don't think we've never really done that. It's been sort of bits and pieces. Just paint the whole picture for you, the soft spots, the potential problem areas, and the like, so that when you make judgments, you'll have all that information.
So Nixon invites him to come the next morning, and this
The
is.
reason I thought we ought to talk this morning is because in our conversations, I have the impression that you don't know everything I know.
This is page 6.
And it makes it very difficult for you to make judgments that only you can make on some of these things. And I thought that you got it. In other words, I've got to know why you feel something. Well, let me give you my overall first. Your judgment as to where it stands and where we go. I think that there's no doubt about the seriousness of the problem we've got. We have a cancer within, close to the presidency, that's growing. It's growing daily. It's compounding. It grows geometrically now because it compounds itself. That'll be clear as I explain, some of the details of why it is. And it basically is because, one, we're being blackmailed. Two, people are going to start perjuring themselves very quickly that have not had to perjure themselves to protect other people and the like. And that is and there's no assurance that that won't bust.
All right, so this is the big moment. This is the cancer on the presidency. He said when he walked in to talk to Nixon, he normally was sitting like that. He said as soon as he said there's a cancer on the presidency, his feet hit the floor, and he had his attention. So he then goes back and gives him the whole story. This is an hour-and-a-half conversation, extemporaneous. He didn't have time to put together notes. And eventually he'll tell him, and if you go, I'm not going to play this whole segment, but if you go to at the bottom of the page there, page 6, segment 16, he eventually says people are going to have to go to jail, including me. So this is at the bottom of the page.
But some people are going to have to go to jail. That's the long and short of it also. Sorry about that. All right. I think I could, for one. You go to jail? That's right. Well, no. I can't see how you can. Well, I can't see how, let us say I can't see how the legal case can be made against you, John. It'd be tough, but, I can see people pointing fingers, to get it out of their own, put me in the impossible position, distribute too many negatives. Let us say I cannot expect your ear, but just looking at it from a cold legal standpoint, you are the lawyer, you were the counsel, you were doing what you were doing as a counsel, and you were not what you go to jail, what they did. The obstruction of justice. That's the only one that bothers me.
All right, so he tries to get Nixon to stop. Nixon won't. Nixon says, let's keep paying these guys. He then, 2 days later, this guy, McCord, gives a letter to, when he's being sentenced, saying higher-ups were involved. John goes up to Camp David to write a report that Nixon asked him to report. And on the mountaintop, he decides, I can't do this. So it's almost biblical. He goes up to the mountain. He has this epiphany. I can't do it. He's with Mo. He says, I've just got to take the punishment and do the right thing. So by the 28th, he's meeting with Mitchell and Magruder, who ask him to lie. Not going to do it. Nixon is told that Dean says he won't lie and that he's going to get a lawyer. So he doesn't hide that he's getting a lawyer. He gets this guy, Charlie Schaffer, who's a former prosecutor. Very interesting guy. He helped put Jimmy Hoffa in jail. He is the guy that Bobby Kennedy sent to the Warren Commission to find out what happened in the assassination. And he and I talked about it briefly one night. A very interesting guy. John then is clearly breaking with the White House. The president then removes the attorney-client privilege. So we have all these fights about executive privilege today and, the attorney-client privilege. In this case, Nixon gave him a letter that says, you are released. He wanted to do this as a public relations stunt because they knew John was going to say what happened regardless at this point. So he lets it go forward. And as I say, at this point, John testifies. Now look at that. John comes in, a week of testimony, everybody's watched it. He's got damning testimony, it's very detailed. But look, there's still a huge difference. Only 19% of the people wanted Nixon to be removed at that point. They didn't know who to believe. And this changed everything because at the end of his testimony, he said, guess what? I think I was taped in one conversation that I had with Nixon. He didn't realize there was a whole taping system. This is the testimony that...
On Monday night, April 16th, I learned that the president had informed the government that he allegedly had taped a conversation in which I had told him I was seeking immunity from the government in exchange for testimony on Haldeman Ehrlichman. I have no recollection of ever telling the president that. I was so negotiating with the government, and the president told me very specifically that he did not want to do anything to interfere with any negotiations I was having with the government. When I learned this from my attorney, I suggested that he request that the government call for the tape and listen to the tape because I told him it must be a reference to a meeting I'd had with the president on April 15th. And if the conversation were taped, the government would have a pretty good idea of the dimensions of the case it was dealing with. I was referring to the fact that the president had mentioned the $1 million conversation and the fact that he had talked to Colson about clemency for Hunt. I do not, in fact, know if such a tape exists, but if it does exist and has not been tampered with and is a complete transcript of the entire conversation that took place in the president's office, I think this committee should have that tape because I believe it would corroborate many of the things that this committee has asked me to testify about. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my rather lengthy statement. I apologize again for its length, but I sought to comply with the committee's request to provide the committee with a broad overview of my knowledge of this matter.
All right, so what's extraordinary about history, what's extraordinary about this story is he put that testimony in at the last second. It was not in his original draft. He put it in there because he wanted to say, look, if I thought there was a tape, would I be lying about this? It's the Comey, Lordy, Lordy, I hope there are tapes moment. But he puts it in there, and these guys then start asking people, John Dean said he thought he was taped. Is that possible? And so they begin to look, and this is where Fred Thompson enters the scene. He has a guy working for him, and they are in the Senate basement where they did their investigation in private. That's not pointed out by any of the commentators today about this private session. All of their investigation was done originally in private, and then they brought it public. So they went to find out what people are going to say. It's just like all lawyers do. Before we do trials, we do depositions. So they're asking, and one guy comes in. This is the other guy, Scott Armstrong in the middle. That's Woodward Bernstein. Armstrong is another investigator. And they come into this guy, Alexander Butterfield, who gets up that morning and says to his wife, if these guys happen to ask me about the taping system, he's one of 4 people that know it exists. He said, I guess I'm just going to have to tell him, and I know it's the end of my career. So he goes off, and they get him into a session, and they ask him about tapes. Initially, he hedges a little bit. 3 hours later, they come back to it. And he says, well, I'm sorry you asked the question. Yeah, I think John Dean was taped. He was taped in all his conversations. And they were like, whoa. You know, that is the explosive moment. That's on a Friday. This is July 13th. This is July 16th on Monday.
So you were employed on January 21st, 1969, and continue to be employed until March 14 of this year. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Mr. Butterfield, are you aware of the installation of any listening devices in the Oval Office of the President?
I was aware of listening devices. Yes, sir.
When were those devices placed in the Oval Office?
Approximately the summer of 1970. I cannot
right, the roof is blown off by this. This is the big thing. Now the fight for the tapes. Now executive privilege is asserted on the tapes. You can't have my tapes. The fight begins. This is how crude those recording devices were. They were in a Secret Service office right below the Oval Office, and then this happens. It's called the Saturday Night Massacre. For you young guys, how many people remember that night? I mean, it was a night where you thought your government was coming apart because Nixon fires the special prosecutor. This would have been the equivalent of Trump firing Mueller. And then he sends the FBI to take over the offices of the Special Watergate Prosecution Force. The Attorney General resigns, his number 2 resigns, and a guy named Robert Bork pulls the plug and fires Cox. There was a compromise involving this senator. And so here's Cox, who was fired. Elliot Richardson refused, resigned. Bill Ruckelshaus, his number 2, refused, resigned. Bork is the guy who did this, which probably cost him a Supreme Court seat. This is back when they interrupted the news for these kind of things. Listen to this guy. It's a little sketchy at first. It evens out. But listen to kind of the...
Nelson Benton at the White House. President Nixon has discharged Archibald Cox as Watergate special prosecutor and has abolished the Special Prosecution Office. As a result of Prosecutor Cox being discharged, Attorney General Elliot Richardson has resigned his post as Attorney General, and when Deputy Attorney General William Ruckelshaus refused to carry out orders from the President, he was discharged as Deputy Attorney General. The acting Attorney General now will be Solicitor General Bork, who informed Special Prosecutor Cox that he had been discharged. All of this happened after a day in which Special Prosecutor Cox had said that he could not carry out the provisions of a new position that the President took on the Watergate tapes, which Prosecutor Cox was trying to get for the Watergate grand jury and which the Senate Watergate Committee was trying to get for its hearings. Repeating, Deputy Attorney General William Ruckelshaus has been discharged by the President. The President, Attorney General Elliot Richardson has resigned. All of this following the discharge of Watergate Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox. This is Nelson Benton at the White House. This has been a bulletin from CBS News.
That guy's about to have a stroke. I mean, you could just feel it, can't you, from watching that? And this is the event that transposes those lines. So the next week, for the first time, impeachment now is being called for in the House. This line finally shows this transposition where Nixon's approval rating is sinking, and that's this drip, drip, drip. This is one of the drips during this period. But now impeachment and removal rises, but look at the number. It's still like 38%. It's very low. And so the Supreme Court then, the next summer, issues this opinion, says turn over the tapes. One of those tapes is the smoking gun tape, and I referred to the transcript as being, with Zelensky being the smoking gun of today. This was the transcript where the President is telling his Chief of Staff to tell the CIA to go and tell the FBI to turn off its investigation. So it's an abuse of presidential power for personal gain in telling them to do this. It's the President directly involved. Nixon had lied to everybody to say he didn't know anything about the cover-up. Here he is directing the cover-up 5 days after the break-in. So this becomes known as the smoking gun tape. It changes all the Republicans in the House, on the House Judiciary Committee, who had not voted for impeachment. They all say this is an admission of guilt. And for this reason alone, they voted, they changed their vote for impeachment. And so about 9 days later, Nixon resigns. This is the smoking gun tape. Nixon admits he hid facts, tried to bar FBI gate probe. He expects to be impeached, and so he resigns then on August 9th. And this is his farewell address. So let me play you this very quickly, and then we can have a little Q&A and to wrap this up. But the reason I like to show this, and the reason we showed this little segment, this is right before Nixon gets on the helicopter with the victory sign that you've seen so many times. He gives this extraordinary speech in the Blue Room. Everybody comes and gathers. He's leaving. He gets up there, And the night before, he had read all about Teddy Roosevelt. This is really interesting to me because he was a student of history. He read a lot of history. Roosevelt was one of his heroes, Theodore Roosevelt. And he read that Theodore Roosevelt on one day had lost both his mother and his wife. And his daughter Alice was born and his wife died in childbirth. So he loses these two, an extraordinary day. He then goes out to the Badlands and he writes in his grief, you know, that you never know what it's like to be on the highest mountain until you've been in the lowest valley. So listen to this, comes out in Nixon's speech. He had read this the night before, which was, to me, him saying, I'm not done. I may be like Teddy Roosevelt. I'm in this valley right now, but I'm not done. Roosevelt came back from that. So, but this is the other reason I show it. This is Nixon, the only time in all of it where he points to himself and said, I destroyed myself. Because he said, your enemies don't get you if they hate you. You destroy yourself if you hate them in return. And then you destroy yourself. Watch his hand. It points to him. It's his admission. So this is about a minute and a half, but it's just extraordinary.
It's only a beginning, always. The young must know it. The old must know it. It must always sustain us. Because the greatness comes not when things go always good for you, but the greatness comes and you're really tested when you take some knocks, some disappointments, when sadness comes. Because only if you've been in the deepest valley, can you ever know how magnificent it is to be on the highest mountain. And so I say to you on this occasion, we leave proud of the people who have stood by us and worked for us and served this country. We want you to be proud of what you've done. We want you to continue to serve in government if that is your wish. Always give your best. Never get discouraged. Never be petty. Always remember, others may hate you, but those who hate you don't win unless you hate them. And then you destroy yourself. And so we leave with high hopes, in good spirit, and with deep humility. Thank you very much.
Okay, so in wrapping this up, I would say that we have a lot of parallels here with a whistleblower, John Dean. He was corroborated by tapes. Our current whistleblower is corroborated by other people. John Dean, we didn't know whether to believe him or not, and it took a drip, drip, drip in the tapes to come out a year later to erode the base that Nixon had. Here, we've already had the smoking gun, and we're about to have, so it's like Watergate in reverse. We're going to have the public hearings after. People already know about what they're going to say and what the evidence is, pretty much. I think people know what's going on. So the question is whether or not these public hearings will change public opinion like John's did, because John started the process, he didn't end it. Here, it's at the end of the process before the impeachment vote. I believe the House will impeach. I believe the Senate will not convict. And I think this will be the campaign issue in 2020. I could be wrong, but I think that it's not following the Watergate parallel because there was this whole year for the pot to boil. We've already had the pot boiling, and people already are where they are right now. Of course, we have a difference in media and all that too, which we could talk about. But that's my talk. This is supposed to be an hour. Do you want to have about a 5-minute Q&A? Would you like to do that? All right. So why don't we open it up for 5-minute Q&A here. Questions? Thoughts? Anybody want to say anything?
I just have a comment. I haven't forgotten that Archibald Cox had been fired and then Attorney General and Weiss had resigned, and it's just my comment is if the current president had tried to fire Mueller, I mean, I think that would have been the end of his presidency right then. And so and I guess maybe ultimately what Nixon did was the end of his presidency, but it just and that was a different investigation. The current issue is different than what Mueller was investigating.
Right.
And there was a lot of talk a couple of years ago whether Trump would keep Mueller in place. We cut him loose, and he didn't. And I forgot. I guess I just forgot about Archibald Cox being fired.
Yeah. You know, the whole question of if Mueller had been fired, would Trump have lost his presidency? I don't know. Because I got to tell you, I think that if you look at the evidence of a president asking a foreign power to investigate his opponent in return for, you know, the aid, I mean, who would have thought that a president could survive that? So, I mean, it's an interesting time. And I wonder, I used to think exactly as you did, he fired Mueller, it's over. I'm not so sure.
What do you think this administration is more looking at with Watergate and sort of learning its lessons or not learning?
So what is the what?
What is Trump's administration learning from Watergate?
Okay, so the question is, what is Trump's administration learning from Watergate? And it's interesting because the guy who's the current White House counsel, a guy named Pat Cipollone, and I had a big case together about 10 years ago. And I invited him to come to one of our seminars. He didn't come. So he's not taking our lesson. I think the lesson is this, that what Bill Barr knows and has done is get out in front of it, admit it, and then say it's no big deal. And the more you do that, and the more you say it's no big deal, the more your people have to stand in line. Nixon was hiding, and then the tapes hit him on top of the head. You're lying, and he was done. Here, we've had a series of lying about things, and then people saying, oh, well, I don't know, and I'm not so sure I know what the facts are. You know, half the people think it's this, half the people think it's that. So I don't think they learned anything from Watergate. I think the lesson they learned is the opposite, which is just go ahead out there. Let me say it this way. Say Nixon had said, as this all happened, yeah, John Dean's right. I did tell him to pay these guys. But you know what? They're good Americans. They're great Americans. They were doing their job. And that's in admitting it, but then explaining it, and then saying, and these guys were worse. By the way, Lyndon Johnson taped my campaign plane, which Nixon believed, by the way. And so it would have been one of those kind of wars where the facts are there, and so people think, well, if it's out in the open, it can't be wrong, or it's been explained. So I don't think they are taking this lesson at all. I think they are making their own history by the way they are doing this. The question is, I don't think the Senate will convict. The question is, what will the American people do in 2020? Will they see it as enough to remove him from office and be activated by all this? Because right now, I just don't think the Senate, the way it's constituted, is going to do anything. Yes, sir.
Do you think that impeachment would be enough to sway the American populace to vote away from Trump re-election?
Say it again.
Do you think that impeachment would do enough to stop a re-election in 2020?
Will impeachment have an impact on 2020? Yeah, and the answer to that is it's a double-edged sword. Okay, so on one side of it, the Democrats could be overreaching at this point, and Trump could then say, I was impeached, it's a witch hunt, I wasn't convicted, you got to really put me back in office, this has been ridiculous. The whole thing's been ridiculous. And there's that risk. It's a genuine risk. It's not frivolous. And on the other side is people saying, This is really bad conduct. I don't think we should have a president doing this. I'm tired of it. And the Senate is spineless and is not doing what they need to do. I'm going to do what I need to do. So it's a double-edged sword. My view is, and I said this in a class today, that if you're a Democrat and you think that this is an impeachable offense, a bribery like this with a foreign power interfering with our free and fair elections, you have no choice. You have to follow your duty and impeach and then take the consequences, whatever they may be. But you would have a much better crystal ball than I do if you knew the answer to the question. I think it's a risk. And Nancy Pelosi thought that too until this tape came out. And then it was like, we got to do this. So I think it's, we'll see about all that. Anything else? One last question and then we'll call it. Yeah, so the question is on the current whistleblower, how is that going to play out? Because there's this intense attempt to try to out the whistleblower. And there's nothing in the law that says the whistleblower has to remain anonymous. It just says you can't retaliate against him. So one argument is that outing this whistleblower is retaliating and violating the law. Another is as long as there's not firing or something like that, outing is okay. I think the whistleblower, I think is irrelevant right now because it's the other people who are saying, I have direct knowledge. Because remember, this whistleblower has secondhand knowledge only. John Dean had direct knowledge. He was a direct whistleblower. In this case, we've got the direct people now coming forward, and the whistleblower can say that, yeah, that's what they told me, but the only reason that the whistleblower would be outed would be so that somebody can say this was a spy, this was an internal person, this was a never-Trumper, and all that. The hope is that doesn't happen, and it shouldn't happen because that's why we have these whistleblower protections. I think ultimately the identity will become known, and it'll probably be after a lot of this testimony is already out in the public. So with that, thank you all for having me. I appreciate it.